Today, we're going to try to contextualize Leith Mulling's book, Black Feminist Anthropology, for the week. Oh God, I don't know, it's with my glasses. I can't see up close with the glasses, I only see driving. This is another model of autobiography, and she sets up with another perspective on the aesthetic alienation that African American or Black women have about the body, in terms of her chapter that she's got in here that's really the images, ideology, and women of color. And that's really a powerful chapter. Images, ideology, women of color. And so what we're going to talk about is this whole issue of, first of all, the struggle within the field of anthropology, the role of Leith Mullings as one of the more highly positioned Black feminist anthropologists, and then the role that other feminist anthropologists, or the whole concept of Black feminist anthropology, in trying to reshape the whole field of anthropology. Now, why reshape the field of anthropology? Why am I an anthropologist? Very good question I have asked myself over the years as I contemplated throwing the whole thing in the toilet. The whole career, the whole whatever. But one of the reasons why I've stayed with anthropology is that it has several, many sectors. It's got Latin American Anthropology Group. It's got all of these different segments of anthropology that have emerged within the last 30 to 40 years to interrogate the field. So there's an association of Black anthropologists, there's an association of feminist anthropology, and all of, I think all of the different, associations within the current American Association, American Anthropological Association, help to, they're like the young Turks. Some of them are not so young anymore. Certainly, I don't see I'm probably the oldest young Turk in the field of anthropology. But there's these margins, these groups on the margin that are pushing at the center. Now, what is that center? Okay. Oh gosh. Yet again, this is the blackboard here. Because I want to give you a sort of sense of, first of all, I want to call your attention, those of you who are interested in anthropology, to read this wonderfully brilliant classic. So this called Anthropology, Childhood Imperialism. It was in Monthly Review, and I'm not sure, I can't remember exactly the year that this was published, but there has been no other article to me, no book that has replaced or superseded Guff. Oh wait, no, let me say, it goes well with Diane Lewis's classic that was in Current Anthropology in 1973. This is a journal. And that was, I think, Anthropology and Colonialism. And Diane Lewis is Black, Kathleen Guff is white. In Anthropology, Childhood Imperialism, in both of these articles, what the women say is that anthropology basically has had a very unsavory connection to colonialism and to the rise of capitalism. Gough especially takes this British focus, looking at the role of anthropology as helping the British Crown to understand, quote unquote, the natives, right? So that when we look at the emergence of the field as the kind of, the establishment of the kind of Euro-centered in here, the in here is sociology, the out there is anthropology, you know, those strange people over there. There have been various ways in which people have questioned this focus of anthropology exclusively in the third world, in dominated countries, in peoples in positions of domination. And then, I think it's the Gough article. I mean, there have been several anthropologists that do really wonderful jobs on this. But the whole aspect of functionalism, which was a paradigm from British and social anthropology, where presumably you could go to a country, you could go to a space, a geographical space within a colony controlled by the British, and describe the habits, the customs, the mores, the ways of doing things, the beliefs, the values, and somehow not see the connection between those beliefs and values and the fact that those people were living inside a colony, right? So when Gough and Lewis begin their critique they clearly have to engage functionalism and what is called the ethnographic present. So the ethnographic present, where you go to a place, you know, you look at all these customs, values, ways of eating, ways of dress, belief, religion, so on. It has, not only is there no relationship between this group you're studying and other groups around you, or the relationship between the country in which they find themselves and the fact of colonialism, that they're colonies, right? But they don't have any past and they don't have any future. They've just got this present. They eat this way, they eat that, they've got this kind of clothes on, the gender relations are this, that, or the other. There's no history, no future, just this present. That's called the ethnographic present. And that has been one of the diseases that goes along with functionalism, okay? Everybody see that?
I'm a little bit confused about functionalism.
Functionalism is basically this concept from British social anthropology that says, or that posits a group of people within a specific geographic space, without only in terms of the functions of different aspects of the society, and without looking at the relationships, either within that society, between that group and other groups in an immediate environment, or geopolitical relationships that might influence the emergence of certain cultural forms.
So how is that different from the ethnographic present?
It's not really. It's in many ways, the ethnographic present is really concentrating on time. In other words, that there's no history, no past. Johannes Fabian, who's a Belgian anthropologist, who I like a lot, in a classic that is very hard to understand, but which might address Joanna's question, Time and the Other. It's a brilliant book of showing how this ethnographic present, and indeed functionalism, go to create a construct of time in which people with history Don't forget the whole concept of history by that German, well, not Nietzsche, the name will come to me in a minute, but the whole question of people without a history, you know, remember the book by Eric Wolf, Europe and the People Without History. The whole concept of German ideology in the 19th century was that history begins in Europe. And so Johannes Fabian is criticizing the concept of third world people or African people as having no history. And in fact, okay, the names escape my memory. In fact, the whole concept of people without history refers to this famous quote, how does the quote go? That he's talking about Africa, and he's saying, let us not dwell on these people who are, you know, who have no history, but that if there's a place that history begins, it begins in the East and ends in the West. It's something like that. History begins in the East and ends in the West, but that Africa has no history. So Eric Wolf, well, he doesn't do a good enough job on this question. He nonetheless titled his book, where he deals with, he's an anthropologist as well, where he deals with Hegel. That's who it is. Hegel is the one who comes up with this concept of the people without history. Europe and the people without history is really Wolff's analysis of the relationship between Europe and the rest of the world starting from the 15th and 16th centuries. Okay? So that concept of being a people without history, no past, no future, and by implication no future, is not new. It has come through the 19th century and so on. So that functionalism, in a sense, follows on that concept. That now, what is Fabian saying here in Time and the Other? And there's a French anthropologist, Mercier, who critiqued also this concept of third world people being what he called contemporary ancestors. Paul Mercier. And how do we make this kind of, how does this reflect temporality or time? Well, you will hear people saying, even to this day, oh, you know, I really want to go to the South Pacific and to New Guinea or Africa so I can see how Europeans were 30,000 years ago. See what I mean? Where they position this evolutionary theory, that somehow by going to New Guinea, Papua New Guinea, or a small kin-based stateless societies, that is looking at the European past. Not the Papua New Guinean present, but the European past. And that allows you to not see relationships. Once you say these are Stone Age people, the way people in Europe were 30,000 years ago, once you say that, you don't have to raise the question of colonialism. And that maybe the way they are, in part, is due to their history and the relationships that are geopolitically ground. Okay, you following me so far? Okay. So, so let's come to American anthropology. American anthropology then inherits all this stuff from British anthropology, from colonial anthropology, where in fact you have a science designed to help governments make policy about dominated people. And if you look at the early classics of anthropology, that's what you find. You find these essays, that some of these anthropologists were hired by the government certainly when I went to live in Papua New Guinea, there were lots of anthropologists hired, who had been hired at the turn of the century by the government, by the colonial government, help us to understand these strange peoples that we have come here to rip off, basically. So this book, a friend of mine gave me, I'm going to pass it around. It's just the most amazing horror. And I brought it because a friend of mine, Debbie D'Amico, you've heard me talk about Debbie D'Amico, who did her field work in Jamaica, a white anthropologist who's really very sensitive to the issues of whiteness and whiteness in the field. She's written wonderful things about whiteness in the anthropological field. She said, Angela saw this in an old bookstore and knew who should open the doors of the secret museum. Okay, now this is the Secret Museum of Anthropology. Right? That's this book. And then she has another little note here that she's written in the book. To Angela was done more to unveil the secrets of anthropology and their place in the front offices of the powerful. A set of pictures and images worth in any something a century of word worth many a century of words and deeds. I can only imagine the process of selection of these pictures and of private publications and issue by the AAA. So the AAA is the American Anthropological Association, right? This book, called The Secret Museum of Anthropology, was privately issued by the American Anthropological Society in New York, which was the former name of the American Anthropological Association. It was copyrighted in 1935. And the acknowledgement in it, the publishers are indebted to Ferdinand Freiherr von Reitzenstein, from whose valuable work Das Weib bei den Naturvölkern, whatever that is, these illustrations have been reproduced. And it is so ironic, okay, that one of the challenges to us is over this whole question of representation, black women, women of color, and their relationship to the evolution of the field of anthropology, that we have this controversial poster that is associated with the film that we're supposed to see next week, that Jen is very upset about. And when I saw it the first time, I said, well, we won't use this. I'm not going to, have this. But it was sent. This film is seen by many black women as being, in black colleges, like at Spelman, and black filmmakers, as being seen as landmark because it's black women representing themselves. But I'm sure that Jen and I had the same response. Jen hadn't the benefit of this book, but I immediately said, oh my goodness, how is this different from this book, The Secret Museum of Anthropology? Now I'm going to pass it around, but I first wanted to let you know the first picture. This is the first picture. There's no words, hardly any text. These people have no names. But it's sort of like this interestingly pornographic, how, what on earth were these people thinking of when they took these pictures? Okay. They're not all black people. Some look even Pacific or even white, but most of them by far are women of color. So now I'm going to pass this around, and people look at them. Huh?
Just the abundance.
The abundance. Hardly any words or anything. It's just a really amazing film. Now said book. I have to say that Leith Mullings and I, the writer of this week's book, she was in Paris in 1994, spring of 1994, doing research, teaching a course. And that's the reason why, if you look in the acknowledgments in Roman 9, she says, over the years in which these essays were written, innumerable colleagues, friends, comrades, and family members have given me help and support. In addition to those already mentioned in the text, I would like to thank Angela Gilliam for proposing the idea for the preface and for her insightful suggestions. So in Paris, when I was visiting her and saying that what each of us had to do was to write autobiographies because we were part of a generation of anthropologists, black anthropologists, that you can, since a very small number of black anthropologists who identify themselves as feminists and of a particular generation. We decided that we were going to do, can I borrow this for just a second? That we were going to do a pilgrimage, kind of like you would do to, well, I don't think it's it. But in any event, this pilgrimage was to the Musée de l'Homme, the Museum of Man, that's what it's called, Musée de l'Homme in Paris, where presumably the genitalia of the so-called Black Venus, what was the title that she had? Anyway, Venus is in the title. Where supposedly this little jar of her genitalia was, and we wanted to be felt as black women anthropologists. We had to go to this museum, see this, and sort of make a stink, or make a loud noise. This was our pilgrimage. So we went to the Museum of Man, because first you have to know who this Venus of this Hottentot Venus was, and what her life was, and how it relates to this whole issue of anthropology. In like 1821, the Hottentot is a pejorative word. It's in all these old anthropology books as a normal word for Southern African women from South Africa, the Southern African region. But people in this region are very offended by this, and they see it as sort of like, kike, nigger, and all those other very pejorative terms. They do not see this word Hottentot as a neutral word. But in around the 1819, 1821, this woman was kidnapped from Southern Africa and taken to Europe to be put on display because presumably she had odd genitalia. And she was forced to travel all over Europe, and you can look this up. Patrick Brantlinger, I think it's Brantlinger, in one of the books edited by our old friend Henry Louis Gates that I like, where he took Jacques Derrida. This is the name of Gates's book that he put together. He edited the volume. In other words, there's more than one writer in this volume. And Jacques Derrida wrote this kind of postmodernist classic called Writing and Difference, Writing and Difference. And Henry Louis Gates took Writing and Difference and even has an argument or an exchange with Derrida in that book and did a volume called Race, Writing and Difference. And Patrick Brantlinger has an interesting and problematic chapter in that book about the Hottentot that includes information about the Hottentot Venus. Stephen Jay Gould, another more biological anthropologist at Harvard, who's usually very progressive, did an article on the Hottentot Venus that was also problematic. And the critique of Brantlinger's article in this book is that while he's criticizing this fact, it's almost like he is titillating and inviting you to enjoy this reality that he is criticizing. That was the critique of Brantlinger's treatment of this, the issue of the Venus Hottentot in 19th century Europe. In any event, this woman was poked, and there are pictures of scientists having this woman bend over so that they can see her genitals and all this stuff. Drawn pictures, not photos, because there were no photos at this time, but drawn pictures from the 19th century. This woman was taken all around Europe, and when she died, she was not even allowed to be left alone in death. Her genitals were cut out and put in brine in this jar that were in the Musée de l'Homme until very recently, and that's what Leith and I were going to go see. We wanted to go see this. It was a very interesting exchange, because now the guards of the museum, this is 1994 that we had this adventure, the guards were African, and they wanted us to explain to them why we wanted to see this, that this was an embarrassing thing that had happened to African people or women, that it reflected the kind of something of the past, and that people were so upset that this was on display that in the early, in the 80s or 90s, they successfully moved they moved the jar into one of those little caverns in the museum where they have it kept, but it's still there. And with special permission, like a letter and proof that you belong to whatever, you can see the jar. Now to me, and to many other black women, and certainly to Leith Mullings, this was almost like a mandate, this whole thing, because it reflects, in a sense, the unresolved contradictions about the relationship between black women and European culture. And this was the sort of purpose that, we just felt, we're here in Paris, I know we don't want to deal with it, we should deal with it. We should go to the Musée de l'Homme and ask them, where is this jar? Because it's something that many black women scholars have heard about and have always thought, oh my God, what, it's just so bizarre. The story is just beyond. It is beyond anything that we have ever thought of. But it's very interesting that one of the issues, for example, that Mullings was very aware of is this whole issue of the relation, this problematic, contradictory relationship, fraught with weirdness, right? Fraught with serious weirdness about the relationship of black women to European culture. So this all comes to a head in terms of the, black feminism and the anthropologist. What is the role of black feminist anthropology within a science that many times would normalize or naturalize that kind of thing happening? Within a science connected to that kind of gaze. Remember we were talking about feminist film criticism? And we've got this gaze, the male gaze, and we were wondering whether in fact there is such a thing as the male gaze, if women filmmakers sometimes use the same gaze. Well, there's also an anthropological gaze. And that gaze goes back to this question of, objectifying, separating, looking at people and constructing them, at least visually, as weird, worthy of some kind of analysis and observation that you would give some kind of animal. So, in view of that, here's the question: for whom do we write? So on one level, the black anthropologist must develop work for multiple audiences. That is, the broad range of people to whom and for whom we write has to include those in our communities whose opinions and interpretations of life are rarely reflected in the media. So that's a responsibility then for social scientists in general, but we're talking about, you know, a Black feminist anthropology and contextualizing on our own terms. And that is clearly one of the purposes of Mullings' book.
Could you repeat that, Angela?
Okay. The Black anthropologist must develop work for multiple audiences and the broad range of people to whom and for whom we write has to include people in the community, in our community, whose opinions and interpretations of life are rarely reflected in the media. We also have to write for other scholars whose alternative analyses enrich our own work. So that's two. We do have to write for other scholars. But we also have to write for the judges of the intellectual caliber, the people who decide whether we have sufficient acumen to do theory. All right? Now, one of the discussions that I had with Leith about this question, theory, was she was saying that when she writes, no matter what she writes, or how theoretical it is, how obtuse, how obscurantist, how complex the discourse and the language, it's always ghettoized by the reviewers of her piece as being applied anthropology. Now, let me talk about what applied is versus theory. And this is a hierarchy that exists for everybody, not just blacks, right? But for whites as well. So you've got this, let's say, vertical ladder. And applied is sort of on the bottom. Theory is kind of at the top. Theory means, are you developing new concepts and models to enable your field to grow and to evolve and to enable some kind of, complexity in the understanding of, in the case of anthropology, social and cultural processes. Now, a lot of times in real life, that means, are you writing stuff that nobody can understand and inventing new words and new concepts and giving, that then people later will copy? You see what I mean? That's what it means often in real life. Sometimes it doesn't. It can be very grounded in reality and be very exciting, like Kathleen Guff or Diane Lewis. But part of the problem of theory is that in our culture is that the more you write for a mass audience, the more you write for those people in your community so that they can understand the product of your intellectual commitment, then the less it's going to be seen as theory. Because if you can be understood by somebody at a high school level, that ain't theory, baby. Okay? Applied anthropology is that anthropology that you kind of use on the job, not a job teaching, like teaching theory, but a job where you have to use concepts of culture, let's say anthropological concepts of culture, which we know is shared, learned and transmitted. That's what culture is. The values and the mores in society that is shared, learned, so that we all are sharing culture because we live in the same society. We speak the same language, we kind of dress the same way or whatever, we have the same kinds of values. None of us probably eats grasshoppers, you know, we share similar constructs and attitudes about food. That means that we share the same kind of culture. We pass it on to our kids, and we share it. That means it's transmitted to a succeeding generation, and we learned it from our ancestors, those who went before us. It's learned, shared, and transmitted. And that's been one of the most, I feel, the most important values of the field of anthropology. It's just that concept of culture. But applied anthropology means that you use it, maybe in a hospital, with patients who are from different cultures. You see what I mean? I have a friend, Betty Lou Valentine, who taught with me at the University of Papua New Guinea. She lives here in Seattle. She is she's an applied anthropologist. Even though she has written work that is still in print and so on, she's the director of Central Youth and Family Services, which is for at-risk children in Seattle, and that come from all these different cultural groups, these kids who are at risk. She doesn't talk theory, she is doing applied work. She's got to be able to know why Samoan kids are in trouble, use anthropology to help understand that, and to help her staff work with the Samoans, the Jewish, the blacks from East Africa, the whoever, you see what I mean? That's being an applied anthropologist. And that does not count whatsoever for the big leaders in the field of anthropology as being anywhere near as important as theory. So when you send an article to a journal, for example, to a magazine, it has to be a refereed journal. And what does a refereed journal mean? Refereed means that another anthropologist, considered expert in the field about which I am writing, doesn't see my name. I will never know who she is, but the journal sends her my article to critique and to say, do you think this journal should publish this piece? And usually there are 3 referees. That's what a refereed journal is. So that when you're up for tenure and you're trying to get a job, they'll ask you, how many refereed journals have you written in, as opposed to the journals that go out to the community, maybe op-ed pieces that you're writing so that a mass audience can see. You see this conflict for the anthropologists, but certainly for the black anthropologists. So these judges of the intellectual caliber of the concepts, who sit on hiring committees, boards of referee journals, otherwise determine, people's academic accomplishment. And Leith was saying that she has never. How can you call this applied? It neither relates to a job specifically. What she's trying to do is to set up a model of theoretically understanding the issue of black women's experience in the United States, and yet it's often been labeled, that's not theoretical, that's really applied. So that's kind of an interesting issue in terms of what she has been working with and fighting. In addition, I think the work that black feminist anthropologists has been doing is focusing on bridging a very complex gap between male dominance in the community-wide struggle against racism and white female dominance in the national battle against sexism. So that's a very complicated little brick to stand on. And Leith has been central to trying to, bridge this gap between male dominance in analyses about race and white female dominance in the analyses about gender and sexism. So that this book is poised to be this, to link race, gender, and class. And I think she puts that race, class, and gender in the lives of African American women. So she's one of the first, one of the most prominent of the Black feminist anthropologists who has taken on looking at race, class, and gender. But she's also been very cognizant of the relationship of how international power and unequal economic relations, right? Geopolitics, in other words. Who has the cookies? Who controls the money? Then how does that affect the kind of, anthropology, or just the way you look at a given society? It certainly determines which places you're going to be considered, valuable to go study. Let's say, I remember the best person really to describe what I'm trying to explain what I'm trying to say came from a Native American anthropologist, Vine Deloria, an American Indian man, who wrote this wonderful book, Custer Died for Your Sins. And one of the things that he says about anthropology in his first chapter is just a masterpiece. Into each people around the world, into every people, into their lives, some rain must fall. Some people have tornadoes, some people have twisters, some people have floods, Indians have anthropologists. And that's what he says. And then he proceeds to talk about how anthropologists not only will come to the reservation, to do research, to write this book, that they will then become the primary experts on. But then when a Native American or American Indian anthropologist finally gets to the position where he's doing or she's doing a dissertation on his or her own people, who decides whether that person gets a grant or whether their project is worthy? But these folks who don't live on the reservation spent a summer or a year or whatever with their social science research grant and basically are the experts on the Arapaho or the Hopi. And the same thing follows with on the Africans. So one of the things that Leith was very aware of doing was that she had to get, as was I, we had to get the cultural capital that is, or the academic capital that is only garnered when you go over there to study them before you could come back and study us. You see that? Since anthropology is like the study of those over there, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in South Pacific, whether it's in Brazil or Mexico, which is where I did my research, then you see the farther away from Western society, this is something I really don't like about the field, the more different the lives of the people are perceived to be from the lives of people in the US or in Western societies, the more academic capital you get from doing the research. So there are no cookies about studying some place that seems, quote unquote, like home, where there is no danger, where basically you can eat canned food or see TV or all of the things that you can do at home. You really get the cookies when you're in the Amazon, when you see floating corpses down the river. Now, that, I'm being sarcastic here. I know, this is very real, but I'm quoting from a book project that I worked on that some anthropologists are very irritated about, called Confronting the Margaret Mead Legacy. And I think Margaret Mead has been a very problematic anthropologist, certainly the most famous of American anthropologists, and her views of the Pacific still reign supreme, right? And one of the things she put in a letter, Margaret Mead put in a letter about being in Papua New Guinea was that, this is so dangerous, this is so scary. Every morning I wake up and there are floating corpses in the river. And I think it was in a later, the Papua New Guineans are so annoyed, they are so mad. And she came of age in anthropology by writing a book called Coming of Age in Samoa. And one of the Samoan historians has said, Margaret Mead separated us from the rest of humankind. She took away our oneness with the rest of the human beings by making us this exotic place where people screwed on the beach, where nobody ever, girls had no kind of problem in adolescence. They didn't have to worry about anything because free love was just, that's Samoa, right? She went to a colony of the United States. Western Samoa was a colony of American Samoa was a colony of the United States, where the person who ran it was a Navy captain, and then proceeded to interview teenage girls about their sexual behavior. And Samoans to this day say, how do Americans believe that somebody in that situation, living with an American, coming to an American colony, controlled by the American Navy, living with Captain Holt, right, who was the head of the Navy, and anybody in a colony is going to tell her the truth about anything, right? I mean, at least it's open to question that those girls told her the truth. On the other hand, she could have done an interesting book on the relationship of the family structure or gender relations within an American colony. She could have done that book. Oh no, this is where she went. To the ethnographic present, looking exclusively at, sexual behavior amongst adolescents, and functionalism. No history, no past, no future, no relationship of power relations between the U.S. Navy and the rest of the Samoan people in this island. And then we still have people who say, no, what she saw was the absolute truth. If Margaret Mead said that's what the Samoans did and were, then that's what they did and were. You can still hear these arguments at American Anthropological Association annual meetings. So Leith went to Africa, over there, but she did a classic work. She went to the over there because she needed the over there to get the clout in the field that every anthropologist has. But she looked at, because she worked first, she went into anthropology from being a nurse. She looked at healing practices and the role of ideology, that is the belief systems in a culture about healing and how that affects the healing process. She looked at power, she looked at ideology, she looked at all of those categories that anthropologists often do not do when they're using the ethnographic present or functionalism. With this under her belt then, she was able to come back to the United States and then start writing about the us, the we, the in here. This is our experience. And so she has put right there in the title of her book, on our own terms. She has brought anthropology home. I think that's also a really important aspect to seeing, to understanding her book. She's also been particularly interested in this whole issue of gender relations within, not just within the African American, within U.S. society, but also within the African American community. And I think one of the really interesting things about her book is that she's trying to redefine anthropology as she does this. She's not doing, even though now she wants to go into fiction, she's not doing this as fiction. She's taking her old essays, linking them, and making this also like an autobiography. This is what I've tried to be through time as an anthropologist. And so these are, a lot of these are essays that were previously published in different places. And so you can see where they were published. So I think that this was one of the things that I also wanted to say in terms of the context within which she sees herself as writing. And having, you know, and having remembered how I began, there's the book going around, Joanna has it. The whole issue of the Afrophobia, you could say, that that is resurging in the United States. And this whole notion of like black women as some kind of queen, whether you're welfare queen or as women on welfare were called welfare queens, or when Lanny Guinier was nominated for doing something in the Clinton administration, and she was a quota queen, and then when and so they had to withdraw her nomination. When Joycelyn Elders said that the safest sex of all would be masturbation, and that we should encourage it amongst our young people in the age of AIDS. Oh, that was so unhip for her to have said that. So therefore, she lost her job as Surgeon General, even though I'm sure as she travels around the country, like she was here a couple of years ago at Seattle Central Community College on a lecture tour, and everybody of every ethnicity just gave her the standing ovation 50,000 times over, because she was saying what she, you know, which is at least a concept that should be debated in the age of AIDS, or at least discussed. And so that the whole thing, I see this issue of the problematic discussion of sexuality that got her job lost. An interesting issue in terms of the way sexuality is this closeted problem, and the sex trade is this closeted, growing problem. Some of you have heard me say before that we had, that my daughter and I are working on a project together in Brazil. And I'm in a grant, actually, applying for a grant in the university. I'm not applying for it, I already got it. But in the University of Campinas in Sao Paulo, where I'm going to take the language of the debate about what constitutes the age of consent that took place in Brazil 2 years ago, where they were trying to lower the age of consent to 12, and juxtaposing that language, that discourse, those speeches, with then 12-year-old children who are prostituted on how and why they get into the sex trade, which is so totally controlled by some Brazilian version of the mafia that nobody really wants to talk about it. I'm a little bit anxious about the fact that my daughter wants to do human rights work with street children for an internship at the end of this year, working especially with prostituted girl children. Even though it means that we'll be working together for a month, people doing that kind of work in Brazil, it is one of the most dangerous. Even nuns, nuns are usually extremely protected, or people from the Catholic Church. But in Latin America, nuns have been known to get killed for stuff. And there was a nun who had to return to Italy because she was doing this human rights work around street children, prostituted street children in Brazil. So if you look at the net, and if you look at the work that is, the organizations, the non-governmental organizations that are emerging, this is a new area where that calls for some kind of an analysis, and it's partly because it's being so closeted. So in this particular speech that I gave for the American Anthropological Association last November, called The Sexual Commodification of Women in the New Global Culture, a Black Feminist Perspective, one of the things that the points that I was making was that in this global economy, right, anthropologists in the new global economy, anthropologists have a responsibility for making visible the complex cultural conjunction that is culture, the globalization of the economy, and the loss of women and children's rights. That is, poor children are no longer have protected status. And if you think that it's different here in the United States, just witness last week's discussion about lowering the age of the death penalty. Remember? So this kind of war on children is a very real problem. And so I think that one of Leith's concerns, or one of the concerns of many Black feminist theorists, is to uncover, critique, and transform the kinds of global and structural inequalities that are emerging today. And so it's especially important for Black feminists to claim this complexity because of the traditional silencing of the global nature of our silenced domination. And for example, though women are allowed to write about and study the problems of women and feminism, when Blacks have attempted to do the same, then we are often said you're being essentialist or concentrating on race. And so that as African American feminist anthropologists rupture the narrative that limits their critique, then perhaps anthropology will go back to having the vigor that it had in the earlier part of this century, when at least the themes of race and culture were discussed within the field of anthropology. And every year, whether it's this year, in 1997, they're always in November, these meetings, 1997 or the year before, all of the anthropologists the president of the association gives this big speech about everyone is using the word culture, or everyone is taking away the debate about race from us, the anthropologists. And in part, that's because we have abdicated the responsibility to be writing about something that everybody in society is thinking about. And I think that that's this challenge. Do you do theory, right? Or do you do theory in a way that is understood by the people in your society that really need to have another way of thinking about some of the issues that need uncovering? So I think that that Leith's work, whether the work that she chose to do in Africa, and she was there at a particularly rich time in the decolonization of Africa. She was at the University of Dar es Salaam when it had just all of these incredible thinkers from all over the world, because Dara was seen as this exciting place where for the first time Black Americans or people from the Americas would be exposed to thinkers from African continent. Don't forget, it's only since 1960 that Africa started to become independent. And it was only since like the 70s that we were exposed to the thinkers from Africa. Before this, the Hegelian concept, Hegel, that Africa is a place with people without history, that ruled, okay? So she uses this, all of this, I think, to come home. I still think, even though she's written this in an easy to understand way, you've got to use the same discipline. You've got to be a disciplined reader to understand everything that she says. You cannot be the kind of reader that likes Barbara Steele, and that's all you do is Barbara Steele. Right? You still have to be a disciplined reader. So let's take a 10-minute break and come back with some of your questions, discussion, and where's my book? That's a valuable book. Okay. I know it's horrible, isn't it? Anthropology. Any aspect of the question?
So what happened at the museum? You guys not seeing it?
No.
Nice.
We didn't really want to pursue it. And it was very interesting that we felt that the guard had a point. You know, the guard, who was the guard? The guard was one of the African immigrants who had come since the 1960s to live in France. And there's a huge African community, and there's a lot of racism all over Europe. And Britain has, the blacks in Britain have a very interesting slogan that I like a lot, and it says a lot, and so little. We are here because you were there. And so, you know, there's a huge African population in this guy was one of it. He just wanted to know why. We tried to explain, well, we were Black American anthropologists, and we'd grown up hearing about this thing, and we just wanted to see the context within which a museum would put this, would find this important, what they would say. And they did have a piece of paper about her, you know, still, and I'm trying to think if they had a reproduction of her body. I think they did. But it was just a reproduction of her whole body. So they hadn't given up the subject. It was just very embarrassing to the museum. And to people who came to see it, they just said, "We can't have this. This is disgusting."
What did you say the anthropological gaze was?
Well, I see it as slightly barbaric sometimes. And the reason why I say that, Tracine, is that I'm remembering, just in response to Joanna's question, I'm remembering a film I saw once. I went to a meeting that had Australian Aboriginal people and people who saw themselves as Tasmanians. And the Australians and anthropologists say there are no more Tasmanians. And so they did a film called The Last Tasmanian. But there are Tasmanians, but what happens is that the Tasmanians who are left are mixed race. And so those Aboriginal people from Tasmania who were at this meeting I attended said that you are blaming us for the fact that our grandparents have been raped, our grandmothers were raped, and not considering us Tasmanian because of that fact. And they came with a movie. And this movie was called The Last Tasmanian. And it was so overwhelming. It was so incredible. It was about why Tasmanians, because they were about to become extinct, quote unquote, from all these various reasons connected to colonialism, that their bodies, and that same argument happens right here with Native Americans, that their bodies represent some kind of something for research. And the whole film is about the Royal Museum of London. You know, and the skulls that just line, it looks like something out of Pol Pot. The skulls, you know, we talk about Cambodia, right, and how barbaric that was. And this whole thing is about how this woman's skull, and like all the Tasmanians, when someone died who was Tasmanian, their skulls were boiled down to get rid of the flesh, the meat of the body, so that the skull and the body could be sent to the Royal Museum. And the Royal Museum has all of these bodies, these skulls of people, and that's in Britain. And so what makes you think that this body, what does this body have that needs to be studied? What kind of time in the other? What kind of, just because they didn't live in huge cities, what kind of positioning are you constructing that causes you know, an anthropologist to reify the body of Native Americans, let's say the sacred burial grounds or whatever, when people, so you know, the Smithsonian has agreed to give back the Native America so they can have their proper burial. That's a real debate here. And it's interesting to hear anthropologists talk about why those bodies are important for research. And so the Native Americans said, well, it's easy. If you really want the 17th century or whatever, just go into Boston and just dig up all those burial grounds of white people. If you want the 17th century, they're there. Why do you need us? What is it about our bodies that are going to tell you more about evolution, human evolution, than the bodies of your ancestors? So the gaze that frames that will, you know, that informs that debate, I think is extremely barbaric. It's a gaze that, well, actually, to make it more of a joke, Bob Newhart, whom I have often loved, I have long-time love, and he was really a comedian. I didn't like his later stuff, but in his early days, let me tell you, he was a genius. And one of his most memorable monologues that he did was on TV, and he said, did you ever wonder what happens, you know, when someone makes something like King Solomon's Mines, and they do this movie before independence, and then they decide they're going to do Son of King Solomon's Mines, only it's after independence? And so he sets up this whole thing of this movie crew going to the place where they made King Solomon's Mines, and saying to people, okay, now if we could just have everybody here come together in the rain dance, you know. What do you mean you don't have any rain dance? Well, what do you say when it rains? When it rains, it rains. Okay, no problem. We brought our choreographer with us, who's going to who's brought with her a rain dance that you all are going to dance. Oh, excuse me, can you turn around so we don't see the side with the smallpox vaccination? Thanks. And if you could just take off your watch so that no one can see that you're wearing a watch. Yeah, no watches. No watches, people. And he goes into this whole thing of constructing this anthropological gaze for this movie, Son of King Solomon's Mines. And then it ends with, there's this scene, this fight with some alligator, a crocodile, right? And with the white hero. And the black servant is going to jump in and save the white hero but die in the process. And it's just really great. I mean, I remember the whole thing of him saying, wait a minute, you know, that's not the way it's supposed to be, and anyway, it's turning out not the way. His whole idea was that it was not supposed to be that way, that this image perpetuated by anthropologists or people who had that time and the other, the them approach to Africa, that they're just not ready for the reality of the African present yet, you know. So I can't remember how it ended, but it was all about how this guy would not jump into the water and do this scene. And he was trying to explain, but this is a tame alligator. We brought him especially from Florida. He's friendly.
Same alligator.
But does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Have you seen that gaze?
So
I mean, the book has the gaze. You'll see what I mean.
How has the anthropological gaze kind of shifted since independence?
Well, one of the ways you will read when you read Oyewumi, meaning that Africans are debating, and this has been an interesting thing. Michael Chege, who's a Kenyan writer, his name is Chege. I'm going to raise this. Michael Chege, Archie Mafeji, who was here on campus last year, right? Googie. Did anybody see Googie when he was here? There's this woman who wrote Male Daughters in the Human, yeah, E.T. Amadioune. You're going to read two African writers in like a couple of weeks. But Michael Chege had a very interesting article on why Africa does not need anthropology, it needs only sociology. Because the Africans have quickly have perceived this field of basically studying social forces as being divided artificially into two. The study of the in here, which is the me, where I'm comfortable, the European, right, which is sociology, and the study of the weird folks, the thems, the strange ones, the people who live in Africa, whatever, and that's anthropology. And so you can't get a grant, let me tell you. I mean, there are certain places where you just can't even tell people you're an anthropologist in Africa. Now, Archie Mafeji is known for complexity. I mean, he's written wonderful things called The Ideology of Tribalism. Or is it, yeah, The Ideology of Tribalism. That's his first thing that he wrote in graduate school or something. But then for the Canadian Journal of African Sciences or something, he wrote a classic where he said it's unfair to judge anthropology negatively as this study of the them. He said because all of the social sciences in the West are fraught with the them and the, you know, the over there and the in here, that dichotomy. He doesn't use that language, that's my language. But, and he points out in The Ideology of Tribalism that tribalism is an ideology that exists in the minds of Westerners. Of anthropology, it doesn't exist. And let me give you an example of how one of my most wonderful experiences that I ever had as an anthropologist. One year in Texas, the Latin American Studies Association that usually only looks at Latin America, and the African Studies Association that was has been the source of great debate in the last 20 years. They decided to have a joint meeting which would allow people to look at, let's say, Africans in the Western Hemisphere more than had been done. And I was on a panel that had something to do with tribalism, and I was also critiquing this whole notion of tribalism. And I saw these several Africans, and Michael Crawford, who was the expert on tribalism, was on the same panel. And then I saw all of these pipe-smoking, tweed-sleeved African faces in the audience. I said, oh, this is going to be cute. And it was. It was an amazing experience. So Michael Crawford goes through his typical thing of how you recognize tribalism and this, that, and the other. And ever since someone named Robert Fitch, who had written a book called Ghana, The End of an Illusion. And early in his book, he has this little footnote that says that the electoral politics in Ghana are often labeled tribalism. But for a case of classic tribalism, you have to go to New York. And I thought, oh, only a New Yorker would understand how true that was. That real tribalism, that is, you can't get along with anybody if they're not your tribe. That is only in New York, the way it's a unique New York problem. And I thought, oh, that's amazing that Fitch, I've loved him ever since, that he put that in his footnote. So I'm looking out in Texas at this meeting, having remembered this wonderful thing about, you know, this critique of this notion of tribalism and how Archie Mafeji's concept that tribalism exists more in the minds of Westerners than it exists as a, you know, in Africa. I thought this is going to be a cute debate. And Michael Crawford gives this whole thing on tribalism. And we all present our papers, and then there are questions from the floor. And one of these pipe-smoking types raised his hand. He said, I really, you know, and I knew that it was going to come because a lot of Africans are like this. When you get it between the eyes, it's because it's going to have come this way, and you will not have seen it coming, right? So he said, I want to sort of discuss tribalism the way Professor Crawford, who's written all of the books, who's, you know, the major expert on tribalism, his discussion of it. And I'm quite disturbed, actually. And he sort of had this, you know, this sort of British accent. You know, you could tell he'd gone to school in London, but he still had his African accent. But he was very sort of Britishy, pipe in this. And and he said, you're an expert on Zaire, a country that is, and then he proceeded to give. So I'm assuming this man was from Zaire, right? He knew the mileage, the square miles of Zaire, and he said, that you seem to have confused regionalism with tribalism, because in the northern part of Zaire you've got this, and then he describes the northern part of Zaire, and then he says, on the other hand, in the southern part of Zaire you've got this, and you've got these mountains and lakes, and that some of the culture is configured by this reality as much as by tribalism. He says, for classic tribalism, let's go to Belgium. A country that you can reach from the northernmost part to the southernmost part in a day. And yet where the library at the university is divided between the Flemish and the Walloons. And the whole country is like everything is Flemish and the Walloons. He said, I see that as a far more classic case of tribalism than anything you've ever described in any of your works, Professor Croft. And that's when he was hitting him between the eyes, right? Because he came around and he stayed, and he gave many examples from Europe of, according to Crawford's own definitions of tribalism, like Ireland, like Belgium, than any place in Africa. So I think that this, in Archie Mafeji, the ideology of tribalism, I thought that was really good. Ngugi wa Thiong'o is a Kenyan who's written Decolonizing the Mind, Detained, a writer's prison notebook, where he looks at the relationship between language and knowledge. Again, going back to that thing of language and knowledge.
What was that called?
Googie?
The book about language and knowledge?
Detained. But also Decolonizing the Mind. That's the cult book of Evergreen. You can't get out of Evergreen without hearing that one mentioned at some point. Decolonizing the Mind. And Ife Amadiumi is an African woman who, she just tears apart feminists, including black feminists. But going to Africa with this gaze, based on what they come with. And that was always my critique of Margaret Mead, is that Margaret Mead went to Samoa with an agenda. And she describes people according to the agenda that she took. She didn't learn anything new. And I think that's the challenge in anthropology. You know, to what the tension between my research project that has been approved by the chair of my department, right? And then learning something that totally goes against my research project that has been approved by the chair of my department. So, I mean, or of my doctoral committee. See, there's a tension there. But I think anthropologists have learned from that critique that has come within the context of the decolonizing the mind critique that Africans have been raising. And so, I mean, I particularly have been very, I like reading people from other countries with other lenses, because it makes me think of even my own society in totally different ways.
Can you explain the concept of reverse anthropology? Is that a big thing?
Reverse anthropology?
Yeah, okay. I didn't know if it was big. I saw a film that's called Ruche in Reverse. And Ruche was a French anthropologist who did most of his work in Africa. The guy who was doing the film was African, who studied in New York and then went and was studying Ruche.
Ah,
so he was
okay.
doing this reverse thing. I didn't know if reverse anthropology was a popular thing or how it
Does he say reverse anthropology in the film?
Yeah.
See, I always see that as like reverse racism, which is like this big Megillah that I don't believe exists. So whenever I see reverse, but I think, you see, because who looks? Who gets to look and observe? Who gets to describe? There's power built there. It's an unequal relationship. If I get to come to your country and describe you, and your conduit to the world as to who you are rests in my interpretation, my needs, and my doctoral committee, right? It's uneven. It's an unequal exchange, as they say in economics. But that's really interesting, because the first Papua New Guinean anthropologist, a person with a PhD, who got his PhD from Berkeley. I mean, he was a colleague of mine at the University of Papua New Guinea when I was there. And as a matter of fact, I told him to go to Berkeley, because no matter how bad the anthropology department would be or would treat him, the Bay Area was the pearl of the nation. And I figured that, you know, he'd at least enjoy San Francisco, even if it was awful, the anthropology department in Berkeley, whereas, and it wouldn't snow. Right. So that if he went to the City University of New York and had this great professor, Steve Mullings, he would have to live there in the winter. And so that was on the basis of strictly that. I told him, don't even think about the East Coast, go to Berkeley. So he went to Berkeley, where he took exactly that agenda with him. He was so mad. It was kind of like a historical anger representing millions of Papua New Guineans that he took with him, that I am going to study. I'm going to do that reverse thing. And so anthropologists go to study kinship, kin-based societies that are considered stateless that is not in contemporary nation states. I'm going to study kinship in the United States. And that's what he did. He did his dissertation on his PhD dissertation on homelessness. And he came up with a very interesting thesis that the loss of kinship ties and kinship complexity in contemporary urban United States contributed to homelessness. And I think that's absolutely true. But he had such struggle getting this approved. And he took, remember I mentioned Betty Lou Valentine, who's now doing applied anthropology at Central Youth and Family Services. For her dissertation and later book that's still in print, which is called, it's about a black community, and she'll never tell you where it is. She never told any of her friends, where to protect the identities of people. She made up this term, Blackston, and Blackston was this town, right? Where she studied the whole question of hustling and other hard work in the ghetto. That's the name of the book. And so Wari, his name was Wari Yamo, I-A-M-O. Wari took that principle to a small town, which he will not name, in California, and did a kinship analysis in California of this town that had a lot of homelessness. And he basically came up with this notion that the loss of kinship ties. So that's always what is seen so interesting about the them. They have strange kinship ties, right? So he does this kinship analysis of California, of a California town that he won't name, and says that the loss of those ties has contributed to the problem of homelessness. So I wouldn't call that reverse anthropology, but he was the first property dating anthropologist, and he did exactly what you said. So it's but it is interesting when people from other societies assess the U.S.
What is the study of, like, what brought colonial powers to colonize called? Like, if one was to study, like, the people who were to focus on, like, the phenomena of colonizing, would that be anthropological, or would that be political, or what would that be?
Interesting question. It depends on which aspect. You know, like there's such a thing as, you know, like Che is a political scientist, right? And his work about Kenya, if I'm not mistaken, it's his work about Kenya, has looked at political divisions in East Africa based on the amount of contact that different groups had with Europeans. I'm almost positive that's Che's work. I'm not sure if it's Che's. But, and I just found that very interesting. Well, that's political science, you know. The contemporary political divisions based on, you know, colonial history. Carolyn Martin Shaw, who's a black American anthropologist, I don't know if she calls herself a feminist, but she's done a really a powerful analysis of Kenyan and the question of female circumcision and gender issues, and she has placed it within colonial, and she calls it colonial inscriptions. And we have that book in the library. No, but she's an anthropologist. But I think that there's a lot to be said for the African critique, that there is no place in Kenya for anthropologists. And in my own work, like in the book Decolonizing Anthropology that just came out, the second edition, called Decolonizing Anthropology. I have a chapter in there called, where I take a model of studying Papua New Guineans, which was about cargo cult. There's a white anthropologist in there who I like a lot, Pam Buck, who says that cargo cult existed. She says, just like Mafeji says for Africa, Pam Buck says for Papua New Guinea, the cargo cult is an invention of European anthropologists and does not exist. It was a logical response to colonialism. What I did in that book is take the concept of cargo cult, which says that a culture will amasses lots of goods in order to get mana or power, to feel powerful. And I juxtapose that with American amassment of unnecessary military goop, whatever, junk. And said that, that we in the United States have the same characteristics that we associate with the them, only we don't want to see it. And that this issue of cargo cult, we can look at the unnecessary amassment of warfare materiel in the United States to give power to certain people. And it's related to the construction of masculinity. So I took a concept that people had used about the them and brought it home. And it's one of my favorite things I've ever written. Where you go back and you read stuff. And since Saddam Hussein, it was written at the time of the first Gulf War. And then I went back to reread it just last year with Clinton reproducing all that discourse. And I thought, I'm so glad I wrote this. And that it's coming out again. It's just coming out again. So I think a lot of anthropologists are doing that, and that's the reason why the field is exciting, is because you do have feminists who challenge the precepts. You do have, these different groups within the field who are reading other people's, who are globalizing or internationalizing the field. And anthropology is just, it's more exciting than a lot of other, in that sense. If you stick to the margins. The center, forget it. The role of basketball amongst the Navajo. I mean, these subjects that are totally useless in that ethnographic perspective. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
That is sort of a side note question. That's a question about what's going on in the margins of anthropology, and that is what, if any, research is being done about sexual orientation as it applies to patriarchy and power, and how that lens of heterosexism is put on everything that's viewed, and what that does to those of us who don't fit that model.
Well, I think that there's considerable critique on the part of some gays, but then gays also have a lens.
Oh, I know.
And so there's a new work that has just come out about the Sambia, and I want to talk to Papua New Guineans about this book because it has, and this is the critique that Ife Amadiumi was saying in her book, Male Daughters and Female Husbands, that this custom where women are not alone to construct families, but that other women step in and support, to see it as an example, or to define it as an example of homosexuality in this Nigerian culture, is to totally misunderstand what you're seeing. And that's the critique she makes in her preface, right? And I think it's Gilbert Herder, but someone has done just recently a book on the Sambia people of Papua New Guinea, and they've done it mixing a lens of exploitation of children, which is of course a valid lens, as is the whole gay and lesbian lens, but they mix those two lenses to come up with something that I don't know how I think about, which is that the Sambia take young boys and force them to, the Sambia men, that they have to go learn how to be men, and their initiation rites mean that they have to perform sodomy on older men and swallow semen in order to know how to be in a position to give semen in order to reproduce the Sambia people. And so the way it's described, and so I thought, I would have to talk to a Papua New Guinean who knows about the Sambia customs before I can even get to this, because it was the discourse or the language about it was both validating the custom as well as using an American lens that had these two phenomena, these two aspects connected to it. And I just don't know if the Sambia would describe themselves that way. And since Papua New Guinean people have been, and these men you see live heterosexual lives after they are initiated. So what is that exactly? Does this exist? Is this the one? All those questions when I was reading about it. So I think everybody's got lens, but anthropologists, the center is very funny about gay and lesbian issues, but not the groups at the margin, because when Marlon Riggs was alive, but he was already sick, and he was supposed to come, and they had assigned, the people who assigned the room, this is the way power is exercised in this association. If the organizers or the leadership is saying that your paper or your session doesn't really count, they'll put you on Sunday afternoon from 2 to 3 when everybody's already got their plane, or the first session on Wednesday, whatever, when nobody's yet there. If they value you, you get a Thursday or a Friday session. Similarly, the size of the room. How many people do you think are going to come? And so for Marlon Riggs' room, it was like a room for 25 to 40 people at the most, and you couldn't get in. It was like, instead of a ballroom, which the so-called big people get, right? These are these fights in the field, and it was clear that it was in San Francisco. I mean, the man was going to have trillions of people. It was obvious, anyone who had known his work, plus the scuttlebutt, because it was San Francisco, was that he was dying. So, how are you going to give him a room this size? You see, he was one of the interlocutors, that is, one of the people who was challenged to field. They do that every year. They have certain anthropologists try to find people who have challenged the field, and Marlon Riggs has definitely made an interesting contribution to that. But so that I wouldn't say the center, going back to this notion that I had on the board of the center, I wouldn't say that the center of anthropology has represented that much interest in the issues of gays and lesbians, but definitely a lot of these groups on the margins have. Anybody else? Come on, one more question.
I was kind of curious about something. You were talking about the title earlier and how she says on our own terms. But I felt throughout the book that she was definitely referring to like African American women as they, and she would refer to like
Can we
minority.
wait until we get into the seminar?
Mm-hmm.
That's a seminar kind of question. Didn't that be our first question?
I guess so. I don't know, just because you had mentioned it earlier, and you said that she was definitely, sort of all encompassing or whatever.
Well,
I don't know.
I mean, that's an interesting question, but then there's also, whenever you do a book, there is the power of the editor. When I say editor, I mean the person who corrects your language. And let me tell you, you can have some serious arguments with people over that kind of issue. You know, the language. Should black be capitalized and white not capitalized? I mean, I have had so many arguments with people correcting mine to put black in uppercase and white in lowercase, and I say, yeah, but if that happens, someone's going to see that as a political position that I have that I actually am not, that I don't share. I think they should both be lowercase. So, you know, I mean, but in contemporary editing world, one is capitalized, the other one is not. You see what I mean? So that you don't know whether or not.
Wait, why is that? Just curious.
It's a publishing convention. Unless you fight it out, that is a publishing convention. So the first person who gets your book, and I don't know that this is the case, but the first person who gets your book is the person who's correcting your language and putting it in the language that befits the publishing company.
And it seems like in order to be classified as like real anthropology, that it would be better to say they.
She might have done it, right?
But also she's making a lot of comparisons between different, men, women, other women of color. And so when she's specifying they, like she's saying they, black women in particular.
But that's a really good point. If I have time, I might try to catch her between classes to ask her that question, because that's an interesting question.
Could you maybe ask her if you're going to talk to her too, her lack of inclusiveness of sexual orientation? Because I felt like that was a really large problem for me. I didn't see myself. I mean, in some ways I saw myself reflected in here, but not as a lesbian at all. So.
Any other questions? No? Okay, see you at home.